the creators of humanity within the woo-woo world are frequently seen as the Anunnaki, which were these group of individuals that came on down and gave us, Anunnaki actually means those who come from the sky. And they interacted with the Sumerians, and they brought in some level of knowledge, and they claimed to be our creators. Now, there's a conflicting myth. The conflicting myth, very much like the one about the Anunnaki, also has historical records. So, for instance, if you go and you look at some of the writings that now constitute the Bible, and you look at it in their original languages, you find that some of the words we've got there are very poorly translated and were done so to create a fog in the human mind. And so there's a word in the Bible that's translated as Holy Spirit or Holy Ghost. And in fact, that word is Rauch. And it is a very explicit word that means that which can fly over water as well as land. And it relates to the Anunnaki. Now, we have a lot of archaeological evidence that the Anunnaki actually visited us. We don't have any, and we have some archaeological evidence that says that they actually altered our genetics, but we don't have anything saying that they are in fact the original creators. That archaeological evidence that we have about the Anunnaki in all of its various different branches is relatively recent in history. By relatively recent, we might be talking anywhere from 200,000 to maybe 1 million years back. But prior to that, there exists evidence in archaeology of a competing creator myth. This competing creator was known as the Nummo. And the Nummo it's a name for a species. And this species is reputed by those tenuous archaeological hints we have, most of them coming from Sanskrit, that it's reputed to be about 8 to 12 million years back at least. And so the Nummo would predate the Anunnaki by some serious amount of time. Now, the Nummo and the Anunnaki were known to each other. And that's relatively recent understanding, and it comes from the indigenous peoples that surround the Pacific Ring of Fire. These indigenous peoples have a greater history of an intact oral tradition than other indigenous peoples because they have been less conquered, less abused, etc. And you find that the stuff that the Salish people around here, for instance, or the Maori in New Zealand, or the Melanesian peoples in the islands in the South Pacific, they all have a myth about basically the Nummo and the Anunnaki being contenders or at war with each other. And one was referred to as the star people, that would be the Nummo, and then the sky people would be the Anunnaki. And they were known to be in contention that we would think of perhaps as a long-running war or something. And the people of the indigenous populations around the Ring of Fire have an extra tradition, a little bit of a wrinkle thrown in there, that said that they knew the sky people were lying. And the sky people claiming to be our creators were lying. And so the indigenous people didn't have a whole lot of respect and didn't want to muck about with the sky people, the Anunnaki. And so they were at war with the sky people. And there's many different individual myths in the Pacific coast, and especially the Pacific Northwest of North America, Salish and Tlingit peoples, about individuals within their tribes being kidnapped by the sky people and various reactions among the tribal members. In one particular very sort of famous case within the Salish, there was an individual that was kidnapped by the sky people, by the Anunnaki, and the ship didn't take off right away. And the tribe assaulted the spaceship and was able to rescue the fellow. it always struck me listening to it that it would just make a marvelous movie. Because of the relative primitives, so to speak, trying to fight the more sophisticated Anunnaki, and then actually being successful. But let's get back to the Nummo. The Nummo we have representations of the Nummo that literally can be found on all continents excepting Antarctica. We don't know that you can find them there or not because we're not allowed to share any information out of Antarctica. But all the other continents have little statuettes, bas reliefs, paintings on rocks, extensive painting in caves of the Nummo. And what is characteristic about the Nummo is that from our viewpoint, they were very ugly. They're amphibians. The Nummo are explicitly described as amphibians, where 98% of them at any given time are female. The Nummo are explicitly described as being able to change their gender in order to accommodate the needs of the species and themselves in reproduction. So they're not always 98% female, and they have the ability to be gender transforming as is required. And the Nummo share certain characteristics that no matter if you're being told about them from the Melanesians, from the Maori, from the Salish, they were all described as, boy, that's a pretty ugly dude. But also they're water-based beings, and they spend most of their time in water, and they had a very difficult time walking across land. They have what we might think of as like seal kind of feet that are flippers as well, but don't really separate out into legs that much. And so they had difficulty actually moving themselves across rough surfaces like the land. And so they were in the Melanesian tradition, as well as the Dogon out of Africa, they were known to use these things that were called shoes. Now, the shoes that they used were little flying platforms that actually transported them across the ground. But in the process, they got hot. The shoe got hot. And so it could set things on fire. So there were agreements worked out with the Nummo, who didn't want to cause fires, and the local populations for areas that they cleared out so that we wouldn't have forest fires and stuff from these guys coming to visit us. But the Nummo are very interesting because the creation myth of the Nummo holds that the Nummo owes us a debt, and that they created humanity because of a big screw up that one of their own guys actually created. And it gets really deep in saying that, go ahead.
I certainly don't want to interrupt your thought. I just want to let you know that I didn't, folks, this is really funny. So I started recording just as you started to speak. Thank goodness we're going to get to hear everything that you said, but pretty much I didn't record my intro. So ladies and gentlemen, yeah, I mean, if you guys only knew how nervous I was interviewing Clif High, it would kind of make sense, but I'm very thankful that the only thing that I forgot to record was my intro. So ladies and gentlemen, we're going to jump right back into it. Clif High, halfpasthuman.com, the webbot.
There we go. That's good enough.
Good. Yeah. And so we were talking to Clif today about the Nummo people, that this creation story. So please continue.
Right. Okay, so you can actually find, if you're a member of the British royal family or in some way connected to them, you can get detailed written explanations of the Nummo and the creation of humans that are kept away from the rest of humanity. And the queen and her offspring have rituals that commemorate the Nummo creating, it actually even goes deeper than that because it commemorates the quote accident that caused the Nummo to be in our debt. And basically what happened is that the Nummo came to the planet here, and they took some DNA samples and stuff, and then they went away, and then they came back, and they brought back with them 8 individuals that we would think of as like proto-humans. Okay, very, very distinctly genetically engineered humans, and they were going to build a race on this planet, humanity on this planet with those 8 individuals. And the problem is that they made the the humans in their own image. And so they could be either female or male. This you'll find expressed as one of the core tenets of Masonry, is that we're seeking to return to that state where we are both, or. And so a lot of the Nummo myth is encoded in Masonry. It goes back into the secret societies, et cetera. But in any event, in the British Royals tradition of it, they tell the story in a very complete sort of a fashion, not 100%, but pretty close. And they align themselves with the guy who really screwed up and caused that debt to exist. And basically what happened was that they brought back 8 individuals. And of those 8 individuals, 2 of the individuals fell in love. And the 2 of those individuals were able to breed, but they did it out of season, so to speak, relative to how the Nummo think of these things. And so the offspring, when they got back to Earth here with those 8 individuals, one was already pregnant and the issue was already known. And then that individual gave birth here on this planet and produced this mentally disturbed offspring. And time goes by, Nummo are busily doing their creation thing here on the planet, and that individual, the mentally disturbed offspring, ends up as a young adult stealing one of the Nummo's spaceships. Now, so you have to know a certain thing about the Nummo. The Nummo are not like the Greys, and they're not like the Anunnaki. The Nummo spaceships, they may at this time be different, but way back when, actually went through the interstellar medium. Okay, they actually took the time and sort of flew from star to star, as opposed to transiting outside of time interdimensionally, if you want to think of it that way. So they were very unique. They could move through space the same way stars do. And their ships were powered by and led by a glowing ball of liquid copper that had been highly energized, that basically acted as a little sun, and it sort of drugged the rest of the spaceship along with them through space, through the interstellar media, which is not a vacuum. Anyway, this is pertinent because when this individual stole one of the Nummo spaceships, didn't know what it was doing, it flew up into the atmosphere and then came back down and crashed. And the whole of planet Earth was polluted by that liquid copper engine crashing back on Earth. The Nummo very hastily got the 8 individuals that they had created and all of their crew into their spaceship, along with their cubes, which were their ability, a crystal cube that they used to store things, and that held all of the DNA on all of the creatures that they'd examined to that date on Earth. And so it was Noah's Ark. It had all of the DNA for everything in this little tiny cube. Anyway, so they gathered all that stuff up, got into their spaceships, and left, or moved off of the planet. They didn't leave the area, though, because they knew they had to do something. And so they extinguished the copper fire, and then they went away to think about the damage that had been created here. Bear in mind that most of the life on Earth was destroyed. Plant life, bacteria, everything was just destroyed by this incredible level of space pollution, so to speak. And so when the Nummo go away, but they're very, very, very moral. These are beings that have the ability to do transmigration of soul. They can seek enlightenment. They have a soul, unlike many of the other aliens that we will encounter. And the Nummo were bound by that soul to a level of morality of ahimsa, do no harm. And one of the things they had created had done immeasurable harm to Earth. So some time passes. We don't know how much time. And it's sort of immaterial. And the Nummo come back because they've got a plan. And from that point on, we pick up our story from like the Salish people or the Dogon people who were deep in Africa at that time. Now, bear in mind that in in all cases here, we have scientific evidence that could not have been known by primitive tribes without external influence. So they knew that the Nemo came from Sirius. They knew that there was a Sirius Sun A, a Sirius Sun B, and a little tiny Sirius Sun C. We didn't discover the third Sirius sun in that cluster until just probably 80 years ago or less. And yet the Dogon and the Salish knew of that and had a specific word for it. They could tell you proportion-wise how big it was to the other stars. It could tell you how it all orbited. All of these mechanics that we're just now figuring out. So they knew. In any event, though, so the Nemo come back, and as some time passes, the Nemo come back, and they basically spray all of Earth with a foam. And this was the foam that cleared away the copper pollution. And it is from there that we get our world-girdling flood myths, because they flooded the planet with this foam that had been, let's say, as carefully engineered as they could to get rid of the pollution, but not necessarily kill off everything, right? So it wasn't like covering the whole planet with Drano in order to scrub it all off. It was very much more subtle than that. And they apparently had to engineer this, and that took them some time. But they came back with their 8 individuals and set about, according to the Salish people here, correcting their mistake. And so the very first thing they did, according to the Salish, was that they're aquatic beings. And so they started creating creatures that could fill the oceans again. And one of the things that they created was salmon. And they did so specifically such that the land creatures would have something to eat. And then the Salish story is picked up with the narrative of the raven, because the raven was the first of the land creatures that was created by the Nemo and was a constant companion to the Nemo as they went around the planet undoing all the problems and fixing things. Mm-hmm. And so we have, as an expositor in the Salish myths, we have Raven, the trickster, who tells us what the Nemo did and how they did it, and how they would always have to be close to streams and need to get in water all the time, and could talk with the whales and the fish and so on. And also the expositor of the Raven here discusses the soul debt that the Nemo have with humanity. Now, I actually believe we are the Nemo, okay? That the Nemo created us in a loose sense of the word, in their own image. We're not as ugly as the Nemo. We're not amphibian. We're not bi-gender at will. But we have something that they have, and that is the ability to have a soul and to be able to reincarnate and seek enlightenment. Now, we don't do it the same way as they did, okay? Because the Nemo were capable of simply producing an offspring, a whole new life form, but they were also capable of producing their own next body. And so they would basically get pregnant and go through a specific process. And then as they died, that they would do the transmigration of the soul and give birth at the same time. And so they would come out with all their own knowledge and so on. We don't have that, but they did the best that they could for us. Now, another aspect of the Nemo myth that from which we get all of these other memes is that the Nemo swore they would return to us and that they would come and see us again when we had discovered who we were. Okay, and it wouldn't do any good to come back prior to that, because the interaction with the Nemo and ourselves was intended so that they could instruct us as to how to work the whole reincarnation kind of thing, right? How to seek enlightenment effectively. And also in the myth here locally in Pacific Northwest is the first place I'd ever seen it, is the discussion that the Anunnaki are extremely long-lived, okay? But they don't have a soul. They're not able to reincarnate, but they have an extremely long life. Nemo, on the other hand, are souled beings and can reincarnate as they choose, but are essentially immortal, but not immortal. They're eternal, and so they're not really immortal. The Anunnaki think of themselves as immortal, that if they can keep their bodies going, they might easily live, tens of thousands of years. Whereas the Nemo don't even try and do that. They're simply eternal, going through various different bodies the same way we are. And so we're eternal beings going through various different bodies. Now, they had to do a lot of different things to get our consciousness, to get consciousness shoved into humanity. So this is where it gets into some really deep woo-woo, because if you examine humans, we're essentially a primate. And as a mammal and a primate, we share with all other mammals a certain physiology that is unique to vertebrates. So 85% of the life on this planet that's animal has no spine. They're not vertebrates. Only 15% of the population of the planet is vertebrates. A very interesting thing if you think about evolution being the cause of all of this. But in any event, as vertebrates, we have a highly complex vagus nervous system. And so if you strip off all of our flesh and get rid of all of the bones and just have the nerve system there, you'll see that we actually have two complete nervous systems, one of which runs through the body, goes through the spinal cord, and so on. And then we have this curious alien kind of a thing that wraps around all of our vital organs, touches the glands in the head, connects to the four senses that we've got in our cranium. And it is the vagus nervous system. And it goes all the way down and it connects to your gut. It connects to all of the major organs of the body except for the adrenals. And in so doing, it does more than simply connect them. It's a transmitter. So bacteria in your stomach produce serotonin, which is taken up by the vagus nervous system and then put to your brain. And so
that was thunder.
Okay, all right. So it's actually very understandable that things like vaccinations at a very young age that trash your gut biome and kill off a lot of your bacteria, and even vast quantities of antibiotics would do this, alter your brain state because you don't have those serotonin producing bacteria in your gut anymore. And so you get depressed. So a lot of the gut issues affect the brain. And we have all of these weird connections between our physiology at the level of the gut bacteria and our mental health. Everything from ADHD to autism to depression, all of these things can be at some level pegged to what's going on in our stomachs. But the Nemo, being aquatic beings, engineered us more towards the aquatic. Okay, we find a great deal of if we read into the cuneiforms, the Sumerian, about the Anunnaki, or even into some of the African legends about the Anunnaki, we find that these beings were very uncomfortable with water, that they were not 98% water like we are. They're very much more desiccated, I guess you'd have to say. They just didn't have that much. But they also had problems because they had never really had to engineer anything around water until they'd gotten here. Now, apparently, according to the Salish and some of the other tribes around the Pacific Rim, the war between the Anunnaki and the Nemo is more of a jealousy kind of thing. The Anunnaki are following along behind the Nemo and basically wherever possible, I guess, trying to capitalize on it. And they do know something about genetics. So we have, for instance, Anunnaki descriptions that can be found in the Maya, in the Mesoamerican ruins and so forth, that is very similar to what you see in the Sumerian, but they're talking about different Anunnaki guys. And so apparently what went on was that some aspect of the war between the Anunnaki, who were apparently very combative, and some other group, it may not have been the Nemo, we just don't know, but sometime in the past in our solar system, the fifth planet was destroyed and it became our asteroid belt. And in that process, that's when the Anunnaki were thrown down onto the earth. And we have the idea of the angels being cast down from heaven. And it was because the Anunnaki couldn't get the hell off the planet. And they had big issues there. So the number of the Anunnaki was small. Their power was great, but you need lots of things in order to build a spaceship. And so you need to have a very large, complex social order to support that whole effort. And thus we see that the Anunnaki that had crashed or landed in Mesoamerica set about designing their workers a particular way. Those that were in Africa had another angle on it, and those in the Middle East had a third angle, and thus we end up with all of the races of humanity that are a little different from it all, from each other. And if we go all the way back and go back up to the British royals again, we find out that they've got this magic stone that the queen or king is required to sit on in Wales, and has to recite this arcane language to their siblings that tells them this story. It's just one of their rituals. And in that story, they say that they are the offspring of that original breeding pair that produced the mentally infirm individual that caused it all.
As if that's something to take pride in.
As though, exactly. You know, because they can say, well, our lineage goes all the way back to the prime pair.
Right. The first psychopath ever to planet Earth. Absolutely.
Right. Right. But they're number one. They're number one.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, though, so it's quite fascinating about the Namo and the Anunnaki, and I take great pains to bring this story up, because so many people that they come into the woo-woo world, they hear about the Anunnaki, it's relatively built up and so on in terms of the storyline, and they think it ends right there. But we go way back beyond that. Now we have actual out-of-place artifacts that would tend to support the view of the Namo being the progenitor creators. And we have such weirdnesses as modern Homo sapiens sapien skeletons being found in areas where we know from our science that that body could only have been put there 8 million years ago. And so in California, I had a lot of relatives that were involved in the gold mining business, and they would find some weird stuff down there digging for gold. And in one area, because gold has a tendency to go with the rivers, any of the underground rivers that they would come along and find these gravel deposits, it's easier to dig those anyway, but also there's likely to be more gold there. And so they would go ahead and dig through these underground rivers that had long since dried up, that are just basically tubes filled with various different levels of gravel and silt and so on. And it is in those tubes that they would discover modern Homo sapien skeletons with ancient animals, old style miniature horses, big dog bones, that kind of thing, where the whole village was trapped in a flood in the river and eventually found their way, as bodies underground. And you can date the bacterial activity in some of these areas back 8 million years. So we do have some evidentiary support for the Namo view, whereas all the Anunnaki stuff, it only goes back just a little bit so far. And it's basically centered in the more sensational descriptions from the Middle East.
Well, and what's interesting to me is that, these really mainstream programs such as Ancient Aliens and, a lot of these sort of in-your-face disclosure types of platforms peddle the Anunnaki creation story as if it is just fact. And this is how humans came to be. We were originally created as a slave race to mine gold by the Anunnaki. And I was just wondering if you felt that there was some kind of an invested interest in the role of, we can call them the cabal, whatever you'd like to call them. Do you think that they want us to believe that the Anunnaki were the original creators? Okay, and because I have to tell you, I've seen reference, like hearing you talk about the Namo, it really all makes sense to me. That there was something far, far older. I never bought into the Anunnaki thing. I was like, there's just no way. It doesn't feel right to me. Oh, and also the clergymen of the Roman Catholic Church, they wear a hat that looks a lot like the open mouth of a fish.
Right.
And is that
there's all kinds of stuff to the aquatic beings, especially in the Catholic Church.
Yes.
Symbols under symbols under symbols. But you're quite correct about the powers that be want us all to believe the Anunnaki myth, because see, here's the thing: in the end, first off, the Anunnaki had hierarchy. They had a military organization, and they organized humanity that way. and they delegated authority to priests and kings and so on. And so those are the powers that be. And if we believe, and so it's the divine right to rule, because the Anunnaki placed your ancestor in charge, therefore you've got the divine right to rule the rest of us. Whereas if we're all descended from Nemo, it's much more like individualism rules, right? Because all Nemo were decentralized and unorganized. Okay, they were organizational beings, but the organizations didn't dominate or take on a life of their own the way that we have them here. And so they're much more, could be thought of much more as, tribal or counselor kind of things, as opposed to some kind of a hierarchy. So yeah, you're spot on with that. And it's unfortunate that we are where we are, but we'll see. Humanity has its destiny. We'll learn how all this stuff shakes out. At some point, we'll know a lot more than we do now. And we'll, other individuals within humanity will be able to decide which of the various creation myths are more compatible, more harmonious. Yeah. But I agree with you that there's a lot of power and money behind the selling of the Anunnaki story. Mm-hmm. And it's becoming even more so as we go along. Now, some interesting things about this, all right? The Anunnaki provide us with the gods, all right? So the Jewish people describe themselves as the chosen ones. And that's actually a mistranslation of the language into English. Okay, it is not that the Jewish people are the chosen ones. It is that they are the ones who chose. Okay, because there was a conflict between Anunnaki and the created slave race in this particular region was allowed to choose which one of the Anunnaki they wanted to be loyal to. And so the Jewish people chose Odani or Adonai, that we think of as Jehovah now. And so you have to really look at translations on this kind of stuff. And that's why I'm a real stickler about this kind of stuff, about getting into the language and what it's actually mean and what did they actually say. And you find out that, so no, it's not that the Jews were chosen by God to have any kind of a special relationship with the rest of humanity. It's that of all of the tribes around at that time, they were the ones that chose to go and submit to this particular Anunnaki guy. And we also find up here, for instance, that there's Salish myths, and they are the people that refused choice. Mm. Okay, and they fought. Mm-hmm. And they figured they would die, but that's fine. Mm-hmm. And so they were, in my way of thinking, they were very much more honorable. Both are equally honorable choices, but I'm was born as a martial artist, and so fighting is my nature, right? And so I respect that more. And the Salish were also presented with a choice, because there were several Anunnaki in North America, and the tribes had gotten large enough, it had to be organized. And so the Anunnaki came out with decrees and said, you got to pick which one of us you're going to be ruled by. And the Salish people said, no way, dude. We got salmon, we got raven, we got trees. You all can go take a hike. And they were probably less molested by the Anunnaki simply because of the terrain. It's difficult to find people living at the bottom of 300 and 400 and 500 feet high forests, unlike in the Middle East, which had been scoured by part of the war. So let's look at the globe. I don't have one here right at the moment, but I'd have to go and get it. But if we look, you'll see that there's these huge swaths of desert area that go all the way across to Africa, go up through the Mideast, take a little jog and go across to, Iraq and into India, and then all the way over to through Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran, and a little tiny bit into China. And then there's the Gobi Desert, another area of this. And then there's a corresponding desert area in the south part of Southern America. And we have the southwest of the United States that are desert. These areas are so not because of natural occurrences, but because of war. And because they were literally scrubbed off by energy beams. And even today in both the Gobi Desert and in the Sahara, if you know where to go, you can go down and find acres of thick green glass that it was all this fused sand from the energy weapons as they were fighting and stuff. So the wars were quite horrific, and the choice period came after the wars. So there was some level of consolidation of the Anunnaki mindset across Earth, and then they, in the process of landing, as a result of the war that was going on, they were forced out of the moon or wherever their base was, and they took refuge here on Earth. But the scarring of Earth had already been accomplished at that point. And so, for instance, like I say, it's just easier to round people up in a desert environment and find them there than it is in some of these areas with intense forests. And so we see the same kind of activity in the Maori language relative to the sky people as we do in the Salish, because they were heavily forested areas. So the locals were able to hide at the bottom of the trees, right? That kind of thing.
I know this is kind of a silly suggestion, but it just occurred to me because I used to live in Washington State. And, we frequented the Puget Sound, and it's just the most beautiful country. I call it God's country, whatever that means, but it's just gorgeous there. But I have to wonder if maybe the human beings at that time were somehow shielded or influenced or protected by the, I call them elementals, but basically what they are is the spirits of the forest. The etheric sort of imprints or impressions of the energy of water, the energy of earth, the energy of, that sort of thing. I do wonder if they were just so influenced by that because it was something that was so true and so real that they couldn't be influenced by a lie. They couldn't be swung in any, to worship this God or that God, but sort of, cradled by the natural area that they lived in. As opposed to the people that didn't have that. They didn't have that, the trees and the rivers and the mountains to sort of ground them, bring them home, bring them back to what, what really matters. And maybe that had something to do with their choice to kind of give up so easily. The next thing I wanted to...
Yeah, it may well have been the case. Yeah, now that I think of it, poor people in deserts, you don't have much in the way of sustenance there. No. So you do have a level of dependency on whatever is your food and shelter source that is not the case here.
Right.
And, we also know that the Salish, for instance, when they harvested lumber for the longhouses, they never cut trees down. They would excise big chunks out of the cedar trees to build the longhouse, and then go on to the next cedar tree and the next cedar tree, not damaging the Cambrian layer enough to cause the tree to die. And so it was an interesting way to live. And they were intimately tied into the thinking in terms of elementals being expressed as beings. Yeah. So, the salmon and the raven, etc. Mm-hmm. So I would have a tendency to agree that there was something unique about the peoples of the Pacific Rim that gave them a different approach to dealing with the Anunnaki when they came poking around. Now, it's
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Do you think that there's something to, I do think that the Earth looked different back then. So it's not what we are imagining now in terms of the surface of the Earth or the crust. But do you think that may have something to do with various entry points into what's known as inner Earth? Do you think that has anything to do with the type of terrain that is expressed on the crust of the Earth that sort of reflects, what's going on underneath? Or in your understanding, are there many entrances, or do you even subscribe to the idea?
Okay, so if you want a real intense discussion about what happens on the inside of the Earth, you need to read a book called Thinking and Destiny. And I think it's chapter 11 or 12 that the narrative picks up about that, because it's not as we would understand it. Okay. But I do agree with you that the nature of the planet changes. We're in the midst of one of those changing periods now. It's continually expanding. That expansion creates a honeycomb effect inside of Earth, just by the nature of that expansion. And it's all energetic. And so the closer you are to the point of an expansion event, the more energy you're going to get. The different energy, or the energy will be different in component than those more stable parts of the planet. And so you're going to take away a different view of what's actually going on around you.
Mhm.
And it's good, I think, inform and help create the psychology, the personality of the peoples involved. And
Mhm.
so I think it is very key. Now, in terms of the inner Earth, you've got all different kinds of suppositions, theories, et cetera, et cetera. But we have a continuous legacy of humanity in all of its myths describing the underworld. And usually that underworld description would have us understand it to be that place that's on the other side of death. Now, but many of these descriptions are in fact, while they may have been altered over time by those people that had a vested interest in doing so, there's a core um, of reliable description that does seem to indicate an actual hole into the planet in which there's larger holes and things to be discovered. And so I'm of the opinion that that is the case, that the crust itself is just this thin layer that we inhabit. Now, I'm also of the opinion that the um, expando Earth theory is quite correct, that back when the Nummo came and they had the accident, the Earth was not as we see it now, and enough time passed between them going away to figure out the cure for the copper poisoning and then coming back that we'd gone through many expansion events and the Earth had altered totally, because there's a couple of things within the Dogon and one or two within the Salish that said when Nummo came back, they were, let's just say, mildly surprised at the amount of extra work they had to do just because the planet had grown so much in the intervening time. And so, yeah, so it gets really complicated and twisty when you start going down there. And you'll see people that defend the ideas about the hollow earth as though their own ego is on the line. And I have a tendency to think, to try and maintain my mental plane such that if I find that something I think of as a fact has dispute or doubt, I'll drop it and see if I can incorporate something else in there that makes more sense. And a lot of people get fixated on a particular paradigm or worldview and then attempt to shoehorn everything into it and also attempt to defend it continuously as though their own ego was on the line.
Ah, human beings.
I know. They're pesky little critters, yes.
Flat Earth, that's another one that's
Yeah.
just divided people.
Well, okay, now flat Earth. Okay, so flat Earth can be traced to a memo that came out of the E-ring in the Pentagon in the 2002-2004 period of time. Okay, and that's where the idea of the flat Earth, and also if you look at a lot of the organized parts of the flat Earth groups, you'll see that behind the scenes, there's a little bit of money flowing in that's got to be coming from government. So I think that that the flat Earth resurrection at this point is somebody's psyop, and it is coincidental to me that, and meaningfully so, that the whole thing sprang shortly after we discovered the giant magnetic anomaly in Antarctica in 2002. Okay, so in 2000 and maybe it was 1999, a couple of satellites are put up. These satellites do magnetic imaging of our magnetosphere, and they fly around the planet, circular around the planet, and they take images of all the magnetic anomalies everywhere. And one of the reasons for doing so is to update your nautical charts. So because of course the magnetism on the Earth is not ubiquitously even. And so if you've got a particular kind of a compass and you're sailing out on the ocean, you may actually sail over an area of a magnetic anomaly and your compass goes wonky. And so your course becomes very erratic until you discover another area and get your magnetism all lined up again. And so there was some thought to create really accurate magnetic anomaly charts from all over the planet, and these satellites were part of the process. And in doing so, they happened to pass over Antarctica, and both satellites detected this huge, huge magnetic anomaly. A magnetic anomaly so strong that it actually pulled the satellite down ever so slightly out of its orbit as it passed over. And this magnetic anomaly was since investigated, hushed up, and so on. But it's a big bugger. And it happened in 2002 that it was officially recorded. And then very shortly thereafter, we started getting a lot of the flat Earth memes coming out in their nascent form out of the organizational psyops mills out of the Pentagon. And why there is the connection, I don't know, but I think that it is meaningful that the two were temporally coincident.
Absolutely. And I think that that's a great tidbit for people to chew on. In the community, just, those two things coincide the way that they do. And the question that I've had is very much, what do they have to gain by getting us to believe that the Earth is flat? How would that change our perspective in a way that interests them in some way? A couple of questions before I forget. A, do you believe that we currently have, or to your knowledge, do you think that there is any kind of study with the liquid copper technology that you mentioned? Do you think human beings have attempted anything to kind of recreate that, or no, not now?
I don't see any. It was quite clearly described, and you'll see it referenced in the Egyptian and other motifs as the bull's horns with the sphere in between.
Oh.
That's not the sun. That was a representation of the copper engine of the liquid copper plasma that was created that drug the ship behind it. And it's always on a headdress, and it's always prominent, and so on. I think we got stuck in the Anunnaki technology, okay? Mm-hmm. And the Anunnaki technology is different. It's the same kind of thing that we see with the Greys and the crashed spaceships. And these are all cyclotron based, okay?
Right.
Now,
it's like kindergarten.
but see, here's the thing too. The Nummo were very long lived. All right, they, in their watery environments, they might live several thousand years for all I know, but they were long lived enough that they didn't really consider a multi-light year journey to be any kind of a particular burden to them. Some of the other creatures here, the Anunnaki and the Greys, the clones, and so on, these are beings where time is of an essence. And so they don't want to go travel through the interstellar medium. They want to zip around it, so to speak, by folding time and space together. And so what they do is they had an entirely different kind of a technology. I was just actually discussing this about the Cape Girardeau, Missouri UFO crash in 1941. Because that was where we first came across the idea of what they called a neutronic engine, or a non-radioactive engine, or non-radioactive nuclear engine. And so that's what the Anunnaki used in their travels. And the way that it works is that you have a cyclotron that is a clear tube, a particle collider, and you shoot a particle through that tube, accelerate it enough, and then you have that particle wrap around a particular atom of a particular mineral, particular element 115. And when it does so, it causes, if you will, an energetic burst that folds time on itself along with space. And so you need only move in the spaceship, you only need to move the spaceship a millimeter to the left once this thing is activated, and you're off of this palm onto this palm. And then when the energy goes away, those two palms separate, and you find yourself in Alpha Centauri without having to transit in between, in that space in between, because it effectively folds space out of the proposition, and you transit, so you're traveling outside of time. And time literally does not exist where you do the traveling this way. And as a result of which, the transit is nearly instantaneous, and the ever-present now is basically the same. So you're here 1 second in Earth, and then the next second you're on Alpha Centauri. And there is no intervening seconds where there was a transit from one spot to the other, because the location was moved to suit you, so to speak. So we're trapped with that technology because of the Roswell crash, because of the Cape Girardeau crash 6 years before, because of the Aurora incident in the late 1800s, et cetera. All of these machines had that same kind of a construct. Now, maybe today the Nummo used that as well. So maybe it was like, originally we were all in electric cars in the 1890s, and then we made the transition to gas engines. And so everybody ultimately had to, as a car manufacturer, had to get away from electricity and start manufacturing gas engines, because that was the big deal at the time. And so it may be that if we encounter the Nummo today, that they're not even transiting through interstellar space the way they used to, because millions of years have passed, fashion has changed, engines have changed, et cetera, right?
Yeah, sure. Right. No, that makes sense to me, that the entities or the beings that were, looked at time as a precious commodity, and it's a rush, a race against the clock. But if I understand correctly, the Nummo had knowledge of both kinds of technology, but because their existence wasn't as time sensitive, they chose to use the liquid copper technology, which I just find so super fascinating, because I have had recurring visions, for lack of a better term, of these gold spherical objects that encompass an enormous amount of energy. They have all different kinds of functions, most namely interstellar travel. Do you think that human beings have been subjected? Could we handle that kind of technology, the human vessel as it is right now? Could we sustain our flesh and blood and bones? Could we handle that kind of?
Yeah, we can actually live and use those technologies. Reputedly, from the woo-woo world, there are instances you can find where people have been taken on repaired space alien craft, and they seem to survive. It whacks us out a little bit mentally, okay?
Right.
So yeah, because we're not necessarily all that stable to begin with. But what happens is, apparently, it's very disconcerting to get into the spaceship, which has no windows. And then they shut the door, and then instantly they open the door, and you're 20, 40, 80, 100 miles away in an entirely different environment. It's just very disconcerting. It's very much like the Doctor Who kind of thing, where, you've got the space inside the little phone booth that he lives in that's infinitely large. And so it's a little disconcerting to open a door and see, a giant cavern there where you expect a closet. But the people do recover from this. And apparently the more journeys you make in these things, the less burdensome it is to your mind. But humans, insofar as their mental state, their personality, we appear to come through it after that first initial jolt of like, what the hell? Yeah. We do well, and we can learn it. Now, I can't speak to the physiology of our bodies and how well that does, because there does appear to be a lot of very inimical effects on reverse engineering space devices on the people doing the reverse engineering. So, no, and also a lot of deaths. Okay, so for instance, apparently we tried to take apart one of the cyclotron things from one of the destroyed or crashed spaceships, and I think it was in area S4, but I'm not really sure. But this would have been in the 60s or 70s, and we tried to do something with it, and it exploded. And we had an underground nuclear explosion that caused all kinds of problems and had to be labeled on a freak earthquake. But it was large enough that it registered on seismos, et cetera. But then, so there's also been instances where you read reports, and you've got to be very careful about your analysis of it and so on. But if you were to look through the federal kind of registers where they collect all of these and aggregate all this information, you find that certain categories of of black ops kind of employees, people that are dark, that work in these holes in the ground, certain categories of individuals don't last long. So for instance, the government in the early 60s was talking about because the data is usually backward looking by about 10 years, I noticed in the early 60s, I came across this reference in a government register about biochemists that were involved in what we would think of as unauthorized or eyes only kind of secret projects. And one of the references I saw was rather startling, because biochemists don't, as a rule, they're not long lived. Okay, their environment as a biochemist is harsh. Insurance companies would say that most biochemists, the odds are they're going to die by around 55. There's obviously ones that live longer, but, as an average. So, but in any event, though, the government was rather hard pressed to deal with the fact that they were getting 1 and 2 years worth of work out of the biochemists before they perished. And they were dying from all these various weird kind of conditions that we would ultimately think of as, I think, basically cancers,
Right.
that sort of thing. And so I don't know that our physiology does well with a lot of the technologies that we've got from these crash ships. But what we have to understand too is that there's a qualitative difference between the ships we've been reverse engineering and what the Anunnaki had. All right, so the theory is, or the meme is, that the Anunnaki crashed on Antarctica and spread across the planet at the end of the war, and that the ones that crashed here had no ability to resurrect their ship and go back out into space, and were essentially hiding from their enemies who were coming to Earth to try and root them out. And eventually those enemies went off, and the Anunnaki lived here more or less peacefully, but still without the ability to leave the planet. And the Anunnaki spaceships at that time were described as basically what we might think of as like giant motherships. Okay, whereas what we're seeing with all of the crashes since the 1930s or landings have been small little ships that, for the most part, because I don't have any substantial evidence otherwise, for the most part appear to be manned by the Greys, who are clones, who are fourth order beings. Now, that may be simply because it may be that they're avatars, that those clones have consciousness put into them from some other being that's off some other place, and that occurs because of the problems with the physiology. So it may be that it's just risky using that kind of technology.
Sure. That makes sense to me. Do you think that the Nemo are currently working alongside some humans or some groups within, humanity to sort of facilitate a fate or a destiny that, we're all kind of, no, you don't think?
No, I don't think the Nemo are here. Okay. Or if they are here, they're here in a form that would be interestingly unexpected. Okay. So we may actually be the Nemo, because the Nemo were soul beings, and they may have, as part of their repair of Earth, created us and then put souls in us from the Nemo, their only source from it. And so
is that essentially a way that they could possibly be working with us, is through us as sort of echoes or glimmers of who they are, working through human consciousness?
I wouldn't think so, simply because the Nemo were not shy. All right. They're physical beings. They're party animals, actually. Okay. They loved good food and drink. They were always seen or always discussed in the Salish myth as being all up for potlucks and just good kind of social beings, and had no hesitation about being physical and so on. If we are indeed the Nemo, we'll never, ever, ever know. And we're now human And so we're not really Nummo. We've been transformed by that process. And I don't know that that's a case. I'm just putting that out as a hypothesis, because the Nummo did say, and they say in a bunch of the different traditions, that the Nummo is part of the debt that they had to pay. They chose to pay to us by giving us souls and eternity. And so we're not immortal, and just like the Nummo are not immortal. And so if we want to think about it that way, it's much more likely that the Anunnaki are still on the planet as immortal beings, getting really old now, and hidden, but not the Nummo so much. And then the Nummo also made a big point of saying that we're all leaving so that you guys can work out your own destiny. And when it's appropriate, we'll come on back and chat.
Okay, that makes sense. And I also heard you make reference to the possibility of deep water civilizations that we do not know about, or perhaps some facets of our government do know, and they work very hard to keep it a secret. But that deeply resonates for me, clans or tribes or civilizations deep inside the ocean. So that, I think, is just a fascinating idea, and it just brings to light all of the possibilities and all of the things taking place that humans are just so completely oblivious to. Is that something that you have thought about?
Sure. Actually, I'm a fisherman, right? And so I've been involved with water all my life, one way or another, and I know people that are involved with it. And you get some weird reports out of guys that do deep ocean fishing. And so they'll bring up fish that have spears in them.
So this is true. So you can attest to that, because I have heard that, and I kind of brush it off. I'm like, yeah, that's very sensational, but could it be possible?
Well, here's something else as well. A couple of different things. The Navy has these ideas. I think they're called fast movers or fast walkers. And so Navy submarines will record these underwater somethings that are moving at incredibly fast speeds, well beyond what we can do with hardly any kind of noise. Also, the Navy, as part of a, let's call it an early warning system, so to speak, in case of wars, had put, starting in Alaska and working their way down the West Coast, they'd put all these undersea benthic on the ocean floor sensing devices, electronics. And they went to some level of trouble to engineer these critters and to go and put them in various spots. And so it's sort of like the reverse of a buoy. So it stays where it's at, but it records all different kinds of stuff. And they were breaking down within, they supposedly were going to have a 10 or 15-year lifespan, and they were breaking down within mere months of being placed on the bottom of the ocean. And it's a classified report. But when they went and sent repair crews, they would say, wait a second, someone's picked the lock here. This was damaged deliberately. And it's not like, the clams down at the bottom of the ocean. My electricity's been unplugged. I've got to grab it here.
Okay.
Operating on one of my laptops, and the dogs can unplug my electricity. So anyway, though, so these devices were being broken into, and we're not sophisticated or not unsophisticated. All right, it was a sophistication that speaks to the idea of using tools. Something to pry open the little latch. It was obvious that someone had picked at the lock, all of this kind of thing. And then it was damaged specifically in terms of transmissions. And so one of the conclusions was that the damage was occurring because of the high frequencies that these devices were being operated at. Now, bear in mind, as humans, we can't transmit information through the water. Okay, so it's incredibly difficult to get a message to a submarine unless that submarine's on the surface. And because we can't send signals through the water in any meaningful fashion. There's the long waves and a few of these other things we've tried. But these devices were intended, at the bottom, were intended to do a specific kind of a burst. and then to let you know that something had happened. And then they would go and retrieve the device in order to get the stored information out of it. And I don't know really what they were intended to look for, why they were there, what their sensor array was, or any of that. I didn't come into any of that level of knowledge about them. But I did find out that the burst was at a very high frequency level. And so the supposition was that we were causing problems for somebody down there, and that this was their approach, where they pry open the hatch, find this particular circuit board, and then excise out these particular circuits. And it would effectively kill the device. Didn't alter its power functions or any of that kind of thing. And then they would just casually shut the door and go about their business. So indeed, we may find that we have cousins, because the Nemo is aquatic beings, and they may well have populated the bottom of the ocean with aquatic kind of humans. I don't think the Nemo themselves are here. They may be, and they may be coming back. We've had some, let's just say, interesting occurrences, all right? And so one of those interesting occurrences we actually lived through where I'm at, out here on the coast. And this was on March 1. I was sitting up working on the data sets for the March report, and the whole house started just vibrating. And it was very much as though, and the noise of the whole house vibrating, we'd only been here barely a month, not even a month at that stage. And so it was a new effect to us. And so we're sitting around thinking, oh, well, it's the washing machine that was totally unbalanced and was whipping around, right, to create all that noise. And I had been doing a load of clothes at that time. And indeed, when the whole shaking part of the thing was done, I discovered that the load inside the washer had been totally thrown off to one side. But I actually now think that what occurred caused the washer to become unbalanced as opposed to the other way around. And it was not the washer that was vibrating the house. But what had happened was on March 1, the largest meteor to hit the Earth in the last 20 plus years came over the Olympic Mountains and crashed into the ocean here off of ocean shores. And in so doing, it shook up the houses. There was a giant bright light, all of this kind of a deal, right? So indeed, now, the interesting part of that is that recently we've learned that NOAA, the Navy, Smithsonian, and a bunch of other agencies all sent boats to try and retrieve this meteorite. Now, bear in mind that they've never ever looked for a meteorite in the water before. This is the very first time anybody had ever done this. They also said that this was the largest meteorite ever to come down. It was about 4,400 pounds, and they had a clear track on it. They were able to triangulate it from 3 very precise radar things. They knew exactly where it came down on the ocean, and theorized that it was going to go into this area that's a 400-foot deep canyon. But when they sent their ships and stuff, they recovered 2 little tiny sub-millimeter particles out of the 4,400 pounds. Their excuse for this, so they claimed success on their mission, but they said that the 4,400 pounds of stuff sunk into the mud off the coast here. And then they sort of let it go. So basically they're blowing us off, right? The huge amount of personnel involved and ships and all of this kind of stuff, and they supposedly had success. But the other kicker is that the locals who saw it, the thing on March 1, describe it as a spaceship. They're saying, no, it was not a ball of fire. It wasn't a meteorite. There was fire behind it, but you could clearly see the spaceship ahead of the column of smoke and fire. And so it was just that it was going so hugely fast as to cause the atmosphere to become incandescent. And so it's just an interesting thing. So, in a lot of the recent UFOs that we've been seeing are in fact coming down over the ocean. And, like the stuff from Tom DeLonge's group, right? We're discussing oceanic UFOs and stuff. And so it makes sense so maybe the Nemo are indeed coming back. And if they do, they're not going to land on land. They're water beings. And so they're going to land somewhere off in the ocean. And also, if one was a space alien and you saw a planet that was 70% water, well, you'd probably land in the water.
Right. Their aquatic nature also, you mentioned that space is not a vacuum, and I really resonate with that. I've always felt that what surrounds us is more like water, more like plasma. Certainly nothing that I could compare it to here. I don't, but kind of like a mixture of, oh my God, that scared me. There is a really crazy lightning storm going on right now. It's July in South Florida. So
Right.
but I do wonder the fact that they're aquatic in nature, and what surrounds us. I've always experienced it as being the kind of like more of a flowy thing, as opposed to what they want us to believe. It's you can't breathe, everything just disintegrates. So that is interesting. The water certainly has a lot of recording abilities. You can hold a lot of information in water. So what, in place of a vacuum, what would you say is surrounding us? What are we suspended in?
I don't know. The vacuum exists behind the sun because of its transit through that interstellar medium. And the scientists call it the interstellar medium. Okay. So even they are not specific about it. We do know, though, that the edge of the solar system, where the Voyager craft have gone, that it's much more like an energy field, and they're unable to leave the solar system. So we've never ever sent anything outside of our solar system. And when we do get signals back from these craft, it's this hiss as they encounter this energy field, and their progress. So from the vacuum, the Voyager goes at a relatively straight and steady pace, and then it starts slowing down, and they couldn't figure out why it was slowing down as it came close to the edge of the universe, because theoretically, according to their understanding, it's vacuum on either side, right, or at the edge of the solar system. And so it's vacuum on either side. There is no barrier or anything there. It's just an arbitrary line we draw in our heads to say this is our solar system, and then the rest of it is vacuum out there.
Right.
And in fact, the Voyagers are stuck at the edge of the solar system and unable to penetrate through the into the interstellar medium. So we don't know what it is. I would think of it as being more energetic, but the Russians are of the opinion that it's much more solid, that it's very much like sand or dust or something along those
It's
lines.
kind of like, I really do feel that. I really, really do get a feel for that. So we've covered a great deal today. You've been so, so generous with your time. I didn't record the intro, but I'm so thankful.
That's fine. That's fine.
I didn't cut out any of your information here. I'll go back and see what I can do with the editing. But Clif, thank you so, so, so much. One last point. If you could maybe expound just a little bit on where you think we would, what the ramifications of human beings on the surface here discovering that we have cousins in the ocean. To me personally, this is just something that would change human consciousness, overnight, if we could see, like, oh my gosh.
The problem with that thinking, though, is goes back to I would agree with you in a generalized sense if we weren't under this control system. So imagine this situation. We have a historical analog for just that kind of a deal, because the investigation into the Mesoamericans was done, and people were exploring all the pyramids, finding things down in Mexico, Yucatan, all through there, evidence of huge civilizations and this kind of stuff. And at the time that they did that work, it was discounted, shelved, put back, because the rest of the people in the Americas were in the process of being at war with the indigenous native tribes, and we were in the process of exterminating the indigenous peoples. And we didn't want to hear that they had a rich heritage that included finer math and science than we did. So there's political stuff there. So that I think that maybe it might be, unfortunately, very similar to that. If we discovered that the bottom of the ocean was populated with people that lived in cities that were aquatic beings and so on, it may not be to our politicians' agenda to grant them, these beings down there, anything more than very primitive kind of sentient sort of things. Nowadays, we recognize that the hieroglyphs in the Mayan world and the Inca world were in fact a very sophisticated language that encodes all kinds of information. But at the time, they were, anybody that brought up that kind of theory was instantly killing their science career, because we didn't need to know that when we were fighting their descendants. And our goal was to, you know, take the lands and exterminate the descendants, right? You don't want to hear that they've got this rich language and that they're comparably equivalent or better than you at science and all of these kind of things. So it's really tricky. The politics intrude on everything at that level. And thus the whole, you know, Anunnaki versus the Nemo, and hierarchy versus decentralization or self-organizing collectives. And, you know, if we lived in a world of self-organizing collectives, it would do so. We'd have, I think we would have a big cousin party, you know?
Right. Wow.
Share some salmon, you know, that sort of thing, right?
Exactly. Oh, and does the raven on your icon, is that a raven or a crow?
That's a raven, yeah.
Okay. And does that coincide with the raven from the
Yep.
Yes. All right, folks. So you heard it. Clif, thank you so much. This was great fun for me. Very, very exciting. I really appreciate it.
Sure. No problem. No problem. Glad to do it.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, folks. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Everybody have a wonderful week, and I will see you next time.